Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so for our second part of the civil rights movement, we're going to take a look at the leadership of Martin Luther King and kind of how Martin Luther King's ideas and his ideology kind of steers the civil rights movement. Then we're going to take a look at the move to try and publicly desegregate in other areas. So we talked about the kind of the leading areas of desegregation and then kind of integration of school system in our last screencast. We're going to take a look at like other areas of public desegregation, and then hopefully, if we have time, we'll get up to civil rights legislation. If not, I'll do civil rights legislation maybe in like a separate screencast if necessary. Okay, so first thing that we have to kind of take a look at is Martin Luther King Jr. And kind of his background and kind of how it influences his vision into how to lead the civil rights movement. So first thing to kind of understand here is that Martin Luther King Jr. is he is a preacher, minister, and his Christian background really has a big influence on the way that he kind of approaches taking on racism, taking on segregation, taking on all of the hatred that African Americans are experiencing throughout America during the time period. And so he's very much inspired by his Christian faith and his Christian background. And that kind of leads him on the path of his famous strategy of taking on racism and taking on segregation of civil disobedience. And so this is the concept or the idea of really disobeying laws that you believe to be unjust, but disobeying them in a peaceful manner. So it's really this idea of non-violent protest. Martin Luther King Jr. is very much influenced by his Christian faith to kind of be inspired to take on this path toward the injustices that African Americans are experiencing in America. But he also has some other influences as well. So this is also a very American philosophy. And if you look back to earlier in American history, you see this during the American Revolution time period where you have tons of civil disobedience and political protests against the British for all the laws that they deemed to be unjust. Think about the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and all these actions that early Americans took against what they thought to be unjust laws. You have Henry David Thoreau, who writes a very famous book called Civil Disobedience, which is again kind of lays out this idea of nonviolent protest. And then kind of more of Martin Luther King Jr.'s contemporary, although he's a little bit before Martin Luther King, is Gandhi, who kind of pioneers this concept of civil disobedience in fighting against the injustices of the British Empire in India. And so you have kind of a lot of different influences for this type of way of taking on an unjust system. Now, Martin Luther King kind of is going to establish an organization called it's abbreviated the SCLC, but it stands for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And this organization is going to kind of spearhead a lot of the protests against segregation throughout the South and trying to combat a lot of the injustices that African Americans are experiencing. They're going to use the network of black churches to try and get out messages and get out ideas and get out protest movements to the black community. So it's very instrumental. It's an instrumental part of the civil rights movement is kind of the organization of black churches throughout the American South. Now, one of the first, major boycotts that Martin Luther King is a part of is the Montgomery Bus Boycott. So like a lot of Southern institutions in the time period, the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama was segregated based off of race. So the basic kind of system here was that white citizens could sit in the front, black citizens had to sit in the back of the bus, and then if the bus was full, black citizens had to give up their seats for white citizens. And so famously, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white passenger. And this kind of was used to kind of challenge the segregation laws throughout Montgomery. And what ended up happening, what the NAACP in conjunction with this SCLC did, was they decided to boycott the bus system. So African Americans across Montgomery did not ride the buses. And really what they're trying to do here is put economic pressure on in this case, the busing companies to change their policies. Now, it lasted for a long time. It lasted for over a year, but eventually it was successful, and they were able to get this bus company to integrate its busing system. So it kind of showed and kind of gave some momentum to the movement and to the ideology that yes, a peaceful protest or a boycott could work to kind of change things in the American South. So kind of going along with this is the whole movement to kind of push for public desegregation. So a lot of people, I think, mistakenly think that when Brown versus the Board of Education was instituted, that segregation was made illegal in every part of the South, which is not really true. There had to be other movements to kind of push for desegregation in other parts of, not necessarily geographic parts of the South, but like in different institutions within the South. So some other organizations kind of get involved here to try and integrate other places throughout American society. So one is a student-run organization, and you'll notice that students become very active. So like young people, like high school students, college students become very active in this movement. So one is called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, abbreviated SNCC. And so they're famous for their sit-ins that they conducted. So this is a famous sit-in at Woolworths, which was a department store, but also they used to have like a big lunch counter. And so just like a lot of other institutions in America at the time, it was segregated, or black citizens were not allowed to dine at certain institutions. And so what they would do is they would go in and organize these sit-ins to try and challenge these racial segregation laws. And this is a famous photograph from one of their sit-ins where, other citizens are basically berating them, pouring things on them, trying to get like a violent reaction from them. And believe it or not, this is the kind of reaction that the SNCC kind of wanted when they did these sit-ins. They wanted to get attention for their cause. And so this kind of highlights and makes the people who are doing, screaming at them and yelling things and pouring things on them, makes them look horrible. And this kind of gives the protesters some of their fuel to kind of move forward, and kind of gets the right type of press coverage to show other Americans really what is going on, in parts of America at the time. So you have sit-ins happening. Then you also have people challenging the interstate busing system. So again, the interstate busing system was segregated once you went across, the Mason-Dixon line into the South. And so you had this group of individuals called the Freedom Riders, and these things called Freedom Rides, where you'd have, mostly times it was college students. They would, get on an interstate bus somewhere in the north, black and white students, and then they would go to the South and drive through the South. And essentially they're trying to challenge the segregation laws of the South. And these things sometimes could get very, very violent. Some of these buses were bombed by the KKK. Because think about it, they're traveling down desolate parts of the South and desolate parts of America, and it's easy for people who disagree with them to kind of like block a road and attack the people who are on these freedom rides. And so things very often got extremely violent. Now eventually the civil rights movement is going to try and push for national legislation. So they're pushing on like a local and state level, and they're being successful in certain cases getting a ton of resistance from, American Southerners. But in other times, they're going to try and push for more of like a national type of legislation. So a major event kind of culminating pushing for national legislation is a famous march called the March on Washington, which is organized in part by Martin Luther King Jr. And then also other organizations kind of come to Washington, D.C. And what they tried to do is have what they would call like a 1 million man march. They wanted 1 million people to come to Washington, D.C. to show the federal government that Americans largely are united behind this idea of trying to push for greater equality in American society. And this is the Washington Mall when Martin Luther King addressed, the gathering here in Washington, D.C. And this is where Martin Luther King gave his, iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. So in this video, we're not going to get a chance to listen to it. If you attend the live class or, in regular class, we're going to get a chance to kind of hear the actual speech itself. But really what this is kind of culminating in is trying to put pressure on the federal government. And at the time, the president is JFK, John F. Kennedy. and they're trying to put pressure on the federal government to pass national civil rights legislation to protect African Americans. Now, JFK, unfortunately, is assassinated before he's able to enact and try and convince Congress to pass civil rights legislation, but the person who follows him in office, Lyndon Johnson, is able to pass some very key pieces of civil rights legislation. So the first one is called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so really what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did is it really reinforces aspects of the 14th Amendment and really the earlier Civil Rights Act of 1866, during Reconstruction. And so essentially what this is doing is really kind of granting equal protection to African Americans throughout American society. So this is a huge victory for the civil rights movement to kind of get equal protection under the law, again, kind of ingrained into American society, and a huge piece of legislation, a huge victory for the civil rights movement. Next one is the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment essentially gets rid of the poll tax. So if you remember, this is kind of taking on, this one is taking on social equality within American society. So these ideas of segregation being legal and kind of gets rid of segregation and gets rid of this idea of separation of the races. This one is kind of focusing more on political injustices. And if you remember, you have a lot of acts of disfranchisement throughout the South during, the New South time period into the early 1900s. And one of those was placing poll taxes on potential voters. And so this makes poll taxes illegal. And so this kind of opens up the electorate to have more African Americans potentially voting in American elections. So that's a political kind of victory for the civil rights movement. Another, political victory for the civil rights movement is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this again is aimed at protecting African Americans' rights and their ability to be able to vote. So it makes a lot of those, other disfranchisement restrictions that are placed on African Americans throughout the American South, it makes it illegal. So things like the grandfather clauses, the literacy test, those other things that we kind of focused on in class, this is going to make those illegal as well. So you have, some major civil rights legislation that's passed. So the key three big pieces of legislation you want to kind of be aware of that are passed on the national level. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You have the 24th Amendment. And then you have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And these are considered to be huge victories for the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement is not over in 1965 when they passed these, huge monumental laws. The civil rights movement is going to continue. And so what you're going to see is kind of pushing for other types of equality, pushing for more job equality, pushing for more equality in different areas of American life. And so it's going to kind of take on different directions in the years following. And so that's what we're going to kind of pick up with our third part of the civil rights movement when we take a look at other areas that are really going to be focused upon to try and push for further equality.